what Kroeber had written 15 years previously about the relation between anthropology and history. This is what he said. I agree with Professor Kroeber that the fundamental characteristic of the historical method is not chronological relation of events, but descriptive integration of them. And this characteristic historiography shares with social anthropology. What social anthropologists have in fact chiefly been doing is to write cross-sections of history, integrative, descriptive accounts of primitive peoples at a moment of time, which are in other respects like the accounts written by historians about people over a period of time. And returning to this theme over a decade later in a lecture on anthropology and history delivered at the University of Manchester, Evans Pritchard roundly condemned, as had Kroeber, the blinkered view of those such as Radcliffe-Brown, for whom history was nothing more than a record of a succession of unique events, and social anthropology nothing less than a set of general propositions. In practice, Evans Pritchard claimed, social anthropologists don't generalize from particulars any more than historians do. Rather, they see the general in the particular. Or to put it another way, the singular phenomenon opens up as you go deeper into it, rather than being eclipsed from above. Yet Evans Pritchard was not entirely consistent in this view, for hardly had he stated it than he asserted precisely the opposite. This is what he says. Events lose much, even all of their meaning, if they are not seen as having some degree of regularity and constancy, as belonging to a certain type of event, all instances of which have many features in common. This is a statement fully consistent with what, following Nadel in the formula there, we might call the sigma principle of comparative generalization, and it flies in the face of the Kroeberian project of descriptive integration or preservation through contextualization. The problem is that once the task of anthropology is defined as descriptive integration rather than comparative generalization, the distinction between ethnography and social anthropology on which Radcliffe-Brown had set such store simply vanishes. Beyond ethnography, there's nothing left for anthropology to do. And Radcliffe-Brown himself was more than aware of this. In a 1951 review of Evans Pritchard's book, Social Anthropology, in which the author had propounded much the same ideas about anthropology and history as those he had set out in his Marriott lecture, Radcliffe-Brown registered his strong disagreement with, this is what he wrote, the implication that social anthropology consists entirely or even largely of ethnographic studies of particular societies. It is towards some such position that Professor Evans Pritchard and a few others seem to be moving. And it was indeed towards such a position that the discipline moved over the ensuing decade, so much so that in his Malinowski lecture of 1959, entitled Rethinking Anthropology, Edmund Leach felt moved to complain about it. Most of my colleagues, he grumbled, are giving up in the attempt to make comparative generalizations. Instead, they've begun to write impeccably detailed historical ethnographies of particular peoples. But did Leach, in regretting this tendency, stand up for the nomothetic anthropology of Radcliffe-Brown? Far from it. Though all in favour of generalization, Leach launched an all-out attack on Radcliffe-Brown for having gone about it in the wrong way. And the source of the error, he maintained, lay not in generalization in itself, but in comparison. There are two varieties of generalization, Leach argued. One, the sort of which he disapproved, works by comparison and classification. It assigns the forms or structures it encounters into types and subtypes, as a botanist or zoologist, for example, assigns plant or animal specimens to genera and species. Radcliffe-Brown liked to imagine himself working in this way. As he wrote in a letter to Levi-Strauss, social structures are as real as the structures of living organisms and may be collected and compared in much the same way in order to arrive at a valid typological classification. The other kind of generalization, of which Leach approved, works by exploring a priori, or as he put it, by inspired guesswork, the space of possibility opened up by the combination of a limited set of variables. A generalization, then, would take the form not of a typological specification that would enable us to distinguish societies of one kind from societies of another, but of a statement of the relationships between variables that may be operative in societies of any kind. And this is the approach, Leach claimed, not of the botanist or zoologist, but of the engineer. Engineers are not interested in the classification of machines or in the delineation of taxa. They want to know how machines work. And likewise, the task of social anthropology is to understand and explain how societies work. Now, of course, societies are not machines, as Leach readily admits. But if you want to find out how societies work, they may just as well be compared to machines as to organisms. The entities we call societies, Leach wrote, are not naturally existing species, neither are they man-made mechanisms. But the analogy of a mechanism has quite as much relevance as the analogy of an organism. Now, I beg to differ. And on this particular point, I want to rise to the defense of Radcliffe-Brown, who I think has been willfully misrepresented by his critics, both Leach and Evans-Pritchard. According to Leach, Radcliffe-Brown's resort to the organic analogy was based on dogma rather than choice. Not so. It was based on Radcliffe-Brown's commitment to a philosophy of process. And on this, he was absolutely explicit. Societies are not entities analogous to organisms, let alone to machines. In reality, indeed, there are no such entities. My own view, Radcliffe-Brown asserted, is that the concrete reality with which the social anthropologist is concerned is not any sort of entity, but a process, the process of social life. So the analogy is not between society and organism as entities, but between social life and organic life understood as processes. And it was precisely this idea of the social as a life process, rather than the idea of society as an entity, that Radcliffe-Brown drew from the comparison. And it was for this reason, too, that he compared social life to the functioning of an organism and not to that of a machine, because the difference between them is that the first is a life process and the second is not. In life, form is continually emergent rather than specified from the outset, and nothing is ever quite the same from one moment to the next. And to support his processual view of reality, Radcliffe-Brown appealed to the celebrated image of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, of a world where all is in motion and nothing fixed, and in which it is no more possible to regain a passing moment than it is to step twice into the same waters of a flowing river. What his critics could never grasp, according to W.E.H. Stanner, was that in its emphasis on continuity through change, Radcliffe-Brown's understanding of social reality was thoroughly historical. So we find Evans-Pritchard in his 1961 Manchester lecture pointing an accusing finger at Radcliffe-Brown while warning of the dangers of drawing analogies from biological science and of assuming that there are entities analogous to organisms that might be labelled societies. One may be able to understand the physiology of an organism without regard to its history. After all, horses remain horses and don't turn into elephants, but social systems can and do undergo wholesale structural transformations. That's Evans-Pritchard. Yet a quarter of a century previously, Radcliffe-Brown had made precisely this point, albeit with a different pair of animals. A pig does not become a hippopotamus. On the other hand, a society can and does change its structural type without any breach of continuity. And this observation didn't escape the attention of Levi-Strauss, who, in a paper presented to the Wenner-Gren Symposium on Anthropology in 1952, deplored Radcliffe-Brown's, quote, reluctance towards the isolation of social structures conceived as self-sufficient wholes, and rejected Radcliffe-Brown's commitment to a philosophy of continuity, not of discontinuity. For Levi-Strauss had nothing but contempt for the idea of history as continuous change. Instead, he proposed an immense classification of societies, each conceived as a discrete, self-contained entity defined by a specific permutation and combination of constituent elements and arrayed on the abstract coordinates of space and time. The irony is that it was from Levi-Strauss and not from Radcliffe-Brown that Leach claimed to have derived his model for how anthropological generalization ought to be done. Whereas Levi-Strauss was elevated as a mathematician among the social scientists, the efforts of Radcliffe-Brown, as we all know, were dismissed as nothing better than butterfly